This is Becky Morrison coming to you from mitochondrial haplogroup K. Now, of course, everybody's ancestors originated in Africa, but the DNA mutations that made mitochondrial haplogroup K distinct originated about 12,000 years ago, somewhere in the vicinity of Mesopotamia. So it turns out I have Egyptian cousins and Kurdish cousins, and I have cousins on both sides of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which really changes the way that I look at history and current events. Um, Haplogroup K is scattered kind of all over Europe. About 1 out of every 10 people in the British Isles, for example, belong to that haplogroup. Now, I've got some famous cousins, including Katie Couric and Stephen Colbert in mitochondrial haplogroup K, and a really old dead guy named Utsi, who looks pretty good considering he was murdered more than 5,000 years ago. He spent about 5 millennia inside a glacier in the Alps. The part of Europe I have the sort of the strongest feeling of ancestral connection to is in the Outer Hebrides off the northwestern coast of Scotland, on the north end of the Isle of Lewis, is a place called Dunashton, where the Morrisons or McGillmores used to kind of hide out when they'd been fighting with the MacLeods and the Macaulays. This is about 30 miles from the Standing Stones of Callanish, which are older than Stonehenge, actually. Now, I've been researching my family for about 15 years, and my big challenge is to get this under 8 minutes. So I'll just point out the last ancestor of mine to arrive in the southeastern United States. He's in the top row in the oval frame. His name is Johann Geiser, and he came from the Black Forest area of what is now Germany. His wife is the most likely candidate for bringing us the tiny percentage of Native American DNA that the DNA evidence suggests that we have. My family is mostly English, Scottish, German, branch on either side of the family that got kicked out of France for being Protestant, and of course a tiny bit of Native American ancestry. Now, this photograph I saw for the first time in the past year, and it was the first time I had ever seen my grandfather's face. I know he was illiterate because he had to sign his World War I draft registration card with an X, and somebody had to write his name around it. He was 45 years old when he was killed in a gasoline explosion at a public garage, leaving behind a wife and several children. My father was his youngest child and was a toddler at the time. Now, in 1943, Calvin Vernon's widow, who was called Maggie, um, had an older sister who had died, and she married her older sister's surviving spouse. So Earl became my father's stepfather, and several of my cousins became my father's stepbrothers and stepsisters. Um, my father had two older brothers who were serving in World War II at the time. Now, meanwhile, in Alabama, my maternal grandfather, Walter B., was not having a very good year. Yes, he had a daughter, but his marriage had fallen apart and his parole was revoked. Previously, he'd been sent to a sort of minimum security new facility for first time offenders, maybe, for receiving stolen property. The family story is that he did not give up the person who stole the car engine because those people had families. And the record seems to kind of bear that out a little bit. But when his parole was revoked, he was sent to the big house. He was sent to the prison that had the electric chair, Yellow Mama. And it also happened to be the prison where one or two of the Scottsboro boys were serving time after having been wrongfully accused of raping a white woman more than 10 years before. I believe the case of the Scottsboro boys was one of the major inspirations behind the novel To Kill a Mockingbird, for instance. Uh, just across the state line in Mississippi, my grandmother Desi May gave birth to a baby girl about 2 weeks before she turned 17. Now, my grandmother did go back to high school, and when she walked across the stage to get her diploma, my mother was a toddler, and my mother called out, "That's my mommy!" But after that, my grandmother left I think she left the state of Mississippi, actually, to go and find work, and she left my mother to be raised by my mother's grandparents. My my grandmother was pretty abusive. My mother grew up in a house that my great grandfather had built on a property that he actually bought from a black family after the peak of black land ownership in the United States. And on this property, he built a house with 13 doors and 13 windows and 13 stair steps. No indoor plumbing. This house never had indoor plumbing. This is the house where my mom grew up. Now, my mom married on her 20th birthday. I believe she had dropped out of the Mississippi State College for Women by then. My dad was stationed in the U.S. Air Force. He never got beyond the rank of sergeant, and none of my ancestors who fought in the Civil War ever got beyond the rank of sergeant. Most of them were privates when the war was over. But my dad had two kids from a previous marriage on the left there. My half brother Bernie actually came to live with us after a devastating hurricane in South Texas, and I believe he actually had some PTSD from the hurricane. So he came and lived with us until he graduated from high school, and then he moved back to Texas. My older sister is a doctor. My younger sister is a teacher. My baby brother is on disability, and for some reason nobody has a photograph of him in an electronic format that I could include here. My mother and father divorced the day before my senior prom, and my mother remarried after that and had another son, Will Be on the right, wearing a picture of Johnny Cash on his t-shirt, which is pretty appropriate because Johnny Cash is a distant relative of ours. Now, my baby sister is in the green dress. Everybody else on this graph, other than my parents, are my nieces and my nephews and my grandnieces and my grandnephews. The half brother and sister on my father's side of the family seems to have been much more fertile than the rest of us. My mother only has three granddaughters. I want to point out the gentleman in the necktie. He finally broke the sergeant barrier in my family. He's a major in the U.S. Army and a graduate of West Point. His wife is a Korean national. Now, this is the house where I grew up in Alabama on a small part of what was the estate of my great great grandfather. I didn't know that at the time when I was growing up there, but he had fought on both sides of the Civil War, and we're not sure if either one was voluntary. His own father disappeared about the time of the California Gold Rush. And I would like to end on a dramatic note with this shot that I took from the local fire department of my childhood home fully ablaze. Thank you.